I have sold programs at the Caldwell Civic Concert Hall for 28 years, and I will tell you now that the strangest thing I ever witnessed in that building did not happen on the stage. It happened in the foyer, on a wet Thursday in November in the 7 minutes between the first half and the second. I was at my desk by the east door, stacking the evening's leftover programs, when the boy came in. He was not dressed for a piano recital. He had on a leather jacket that had taken some weather, heavy boots with road mud on the heels, and a helmet tucked under one arm with a Courier company's name stenciled across the back. He was young, early 20s, I'd have said, with dark hair pushed flat by the rain, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around the foyer the way a person does when a room is nicer than they expected and a little more occupied. He was only sheltering, that was clear. He shook the water from his jacket, glanced at the notice board, and then, perhaps because the crowd was thick near the bar, and he had nowhere obvious to go, he drifted along the far wall toward the old upright that lives in the corner of the north alcove. We keep it tuned. It was used for the young students' warm-up classes on Saturday mornings, and sometimes a waiting performer would sit at it before a show. Mostly it was ignored. The boy stood at it, looking at the keys the way you might look at something you hadn't seen in a long time. He didn't sit. He just ran 2 fingers along the top of the case, almost without meaning to, and I thought nothing more of it. Then Vincent Carew noticed him. Carew had been a patron of this hall for 15 years, and he had never let you forget it. He was a wide, well-tailored man who moved through intermission crowds like a ship that expects the water to part, glass of red in hand, a pair of other patrons in his orbit, a voice built for rooms where other people's voices were expected to lower. I had a civil arrangement with the man. He did not bother me, and I did not roll my eyes where he could see. He was mid-anecdote when he caught sight of the Courier at the piano, and he stopped. "I beg your pardon," he said, not quietly. The nearest dozen people turned. "Is that young man about to play?" Nobody answered him, but the young man heard. He looked up from the keys, unhurried, and met Carew's look across the room. "Just looking," he said. "Well." Carew swirled his glass and let the pause do the work. "By all means then, play something. Give us a tune." He smiled the way people do when they're not really smiling. If a man can play, he ought to play. Mightn't be another chance like this. He let his eyes travel once over the leather jacket, the boots, the helmet. People nearest him had gone very still. "In fact," he said, and now I recognized the tone, I had heard it from that man before, and it never preceded anything generous. "If this young fellow can actually play that piano, I will kneel on this floor. Right here, front of all of you." Someone gave a small, startled laugh. Someone else said his name in a low warning, one of his orbit, but Carew had committed, and he was the sort of man who held his positions. The boy looked at him for a long moment. He set the helmet down on top of the upright, quietly as if he had all the time there was. Then he sat down on the bench. He adjusted it, not with the fuss of a performer, with the practical ease of someone who has done it 10,000 times and learned to do it without thinking. He set his feet on the pedals. He looked at the keys. The foyer was not silent yet. There was still the sound of the bar, and voices from the far corridor, and the rustling of a program near my desk. But the knot of people around Carew had gone quiet, and a few others nearby had turned to watch, drawn by the quality of the waiting, that particular hush that falls in the half-second before someone does something that cannot be taken back. He played the first note. It was a C middle of the keyboard, no force behind it at all, just a single note, placed like a question the room hadn't thought to ask. And then the next note, and the next, and I recognized it before the 4th bar. Bach, Prelude in C major, from the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. I had heard it played in this hall before. I had heard it played by people with conservatory diplomas and international credits and their names on the printed program. I had never heard it played quite like this. He played it without ornament. He played it as if he were reading something aloud that deserved to be read clearly. Every word in its place, nothing hurried. But there was a weight in his left hand that I can only call patience. The kind that comes not from drilling a piece until it is obedient, from sitting with it until you understand it. The arpeggios rolled through the foyer, and the ceiling caught them and sent them back changed, and the bar conversation had stopped now. and people had turned, and the wide corridor to the hall was filling with faces. Courier had not moved. He stood with his glass halfway to his lips, and he did not drink. The Bach ended. The final chord rang in the plaster and settled. The boy did not stand. He stayed at the bench, and in the quiet after the last note I thought he was finished, and then his hands moved again. This time there was no piece I recognized, no composer you could name, no title that lived in a program. It was something of his own, something he carried the way. Some people carry a song they heard once in childhood, and have been hearing ever since inside their own heads without quite knowing it. It began low and slow, the left hand walking a simple line, patient as breathing, and the right hand found a melody above it that was not elaborate, and was not showy, and was not trying to be anything other than true. I have been in that hall for 28 years. I have watched conductors raise their batons and heard the moment a full orchestra gathers itself into a single intention. I know what it feels like when music stops being sound and starts being something else, something that gets into the body before the mind catches it. This was that. The woman beside me, a subscriber of 12 years whom I knew by sight and liked very much, her hand over her mouth. She was not making a sound. She was simply holding herself together. Across the foyer, a man in a black coat had turned from his companion and was looking at the floor with the careful focus of a person who does not want to be seen, feeling something in public. Courier stood. He had lowered his glass now to his side, and his face had lost the expression it usually wore, the assembled look of a man who expects to be agreed with. In its place was something simpler and less arranged. He did not look away from the piano. The melody turned and rose, and then came back down the way it had come, like a man returning by the same road he left on, knowing now what he was returning to. The left hand held steady all the way through. At the end, the right hand played the last phrase once, then again an octave lower, then let it go. A single note diminishing in the old upright's plaster-warm resonance, and then nothing. The foyer held its breath. I do not know who began the applause. It came up from several places at once, the way it does when people have forgotten to wait for permission. I heard it against my own hands before I was aware I had started. The boy sat for a moment longer, his hands resting in his lap. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and picked up the helmet from the top of the piano with the same quiet practicality with which he had set it down. Vincent Courier walked across the foyer. He was not a limber man, and it took him longer than it might have, and those around him watched without a word, because there was nothing to say that would not have made it smaller. He reached the open floor in front of the upright piano. He looked at the courier, who looked back without triumph or mockery, or any need to make the moment more than it was. Courier went down onto one knee on the marble floor stiffly, with the full cost of it visible in his face, and he stayed there for the count of 3 breaths, and he rose. The applause came again, not the raucous kind, not the loud celebrating kind that wants to say something and has not found the words. The boy nodded once. He pulled the helmet under his arm and walked toward the east door, back out into the rain, without looking to see who watched him go. I stood at my desk with a program still in my hand, and I thought, 28 years. 28 years in this building, and I have stood in this foyer, while some of the finest musicians of this era walked in through that door. I have folded programs and taken tickets and counted the house, and I have heard music in that hall that made me glad to be alive. And then, a young man in a wet leather jacket sat down at the lobby piano for 7 minutes on a Thursday in November, and I understood, all over again, the way you have to keep learning the same thing, that you cannot hear talent coming. You cannot see it in the boots, or the jacket, or the helmet tucked under an arm. It arrives when it arrives, and it doesn't ask the room's permission. The door closed behind him. The bell rang for the second half. I did not sell a single program for the rest of that night. I simply stood at my desk, and I listened, and I thought about the boy and the Bach, and the other piece, the one without a name, and how it filled that old hall, the way something fills a space that didn't know it was empty. I've thought about it most days since.